What's up, guys? Welcome into Chargers Weekly. As always, joined by Matt Money Smith, and we're taping this right after Tom Telesco's end-of-season press conference. And Money, let's just get right to the most important question. You asked about his quarter zip, if his quarter zip was a size smaller than it should have been, and then you followed up with a great question about maybe was it better to do this a couple of weeks later. And Tom referenced this was one of the worst or toughest professional losses of his career, that Week 18 game against the Raiders.
Yeah, he opened the press conference by pointing out that, he apologized for not being able to do it right away, but that it was probably good. So he wasn't just focused on Week 18 and yet was able to kind of speak to the season as a whole, which is why I just kind of backtracked because, I just always find it interesting, that the professionals and players and coaches move on to on to the next play, on to the next game, but don't go 2 weeks ahead, just the next one, next play. It's always funny, kind of the cliches that get spit out and whether or not if it really kind of holds. And when you have a final game like that, and the way Tom answered the question, I think you could tell that, no, he has not passed it. And I suspect a lot of players aren't, and he pointed out what made it so tough, that it's the very last game and it goes to overtime and it's the very last play. And there are zeros on the clock when your season comes to an end. And that play also could have ended with your season not coming to an end. And that's what makes it so tough, that it ends so abruptly. And all of a sudden, and he talked about the momentum, and I agree with him. I don't think that's just, trying to paint a picture of positivity. I have felt it different in this market. There is excitement about the way the Chargers play football, about the development of Justin Herbert, about the return of Derwin James, and it's an exciting brand of football. And, I think we talked about this either last week or it was after the Chiefs game. You want to reward the people in LA, now that they're starting to come around and like, all right, you know what? I'm feeling this. My kids are into it. They're wearing, my son or my daughter's wearing a Justin Herbert jersey. Let's go to a Charger game. You want it to pay off. And I got a little bit of that from Tom, that, man, it really would have been nice to reward the fans, the people that are coming around to the Chargers here in Los Angeles with a berth in the playoffs. And I think he touched on something else that we talked about, Chris, and I thought this team was good enough. I thought just get in, and I like the matchups. And, I think they got a shot. Now, I didn't know Buffalo was going to look like the buzzsaw that they looked like against the Patriots, because that's where they would have been. But I think I can certainly echo his sentiment about kind of why it was that last game is clearly still stuck with him 2 weeks later.
Yeah, well, a couple things there, too, because, if you have a crushing loss like that in Week 9, you got Week 10, right? You got Week 11. When you have it in Week 18, you got nothing but the offseason, and you can't wait to get back on the field for 2022. So that's one thing. And you mentioned just wanting to reward the fans. Tom said, obviously the number one priority is to win a championship, but that 1A is to play an entertaining brand of football, which they certainly did this year. And let's just kick it off with the identity of the team. He led by just saying he loves what Brandon Staley's doing, what he's built in just 1 year. And he says, basically, we have a clear vision of who we are, how we're going to play football. And that's not going to change in 2022, Money.
Yeah, that was something we talked about after the Chiefs game, that whatever your position may be on the decision-making, going forward on 4th and goal, skipping a 28-yard field goal, leaving points on the field, going into overtime and losing. And if you don't like that, then you don't like the way they did it against Cleveland or against Pittsburgh or against Kansas City and Arrowhead. And I think that's what Tom was alluding to is, I'm not going to litigate the 4th and 1.5 from the 18. What I'm going to talk about is, this is our identity. This is the way that this coaching staff and this head coach wants to play football. And I support that 100%. So I think I think that's the way you have to address it. Because I would imagine, those conversations are never going to be public. If he doesn't like going forward on 4th and 18 against the Raiders, in the third quarter, he's not going to tell us that, but I think the more important part, and whether or not you want to hear him give you that answer, I don't really care. If you were to ask me, I would think he probably wasn't crazy about it. But I think the more important point is I like the way we play football. I like the approach that Brandon Staley takes, and I'm going to back that 100%. If that means you have to take a couple of these in order to get a couple of these, then I'm okay with it. And I think that's kind of the point he was making, is it's not about that one play. It's about the philosophy as a whole, and the front office and the coaching staff seem to be in step for that.
When asked about the defense, I found it interesting. He said he may have overestimated how good they were going to be on defense. And I think there's a myriad of factors within that for why he thought that. And he also thought that the offense was going to be behind the defense, and it ended up being kind of the opposite, where they're setting team records, and Justin Herbert's breaking every imaginable quarterback record the franchise has ever seen. So I did find that interesting that he thought that defense may carry this team in 2021, and it was actually the opposite.
Yeah, it's and as he was saying that, I started kind of doing inventory, in my brain, this tiny little brain I have, and I'm thinking like, okay, well, why would he think that? And then I'm like, Chenna had a good year. Joey Bosa had a Pro Bowl year. Justin Jones went down, and the line wasn't the same in his absence. Kaiser White had an exceptional year. I think most Charger fans would be really upset if he wasn't re-signed, considering kind of what he's turned into, almost the prototypical linebacker with size, speed, ability, athleticism. Drew Tranquil had a really good year. I think really where they were let down was just one spot, and that's corner. And it's part attrition, and I think it was part performance. And, if you were to ask me, look, you got to have it on all levels. And, it's just like the right tackle position, right, that we saw against the Raiders. And if you got one weak spot, they'll find it, and they will exploit it until you got a solution. And I think that's kind of what I think the run defense, and he alluded to this, he didn't say it specifically, but he pointed out when he was asked about the run defense, he's like, look, it's an 11-man approach. It's not just that line. And I think to me, that's kind of what he was speaking to. And he addressed Kenneth Murray and what was a disappointing year for Kenneth, and how they hope he can bounce back. He pointed to a really bad ankle injury, and you got the sense maybe Kenneth had a rougher go with COVID than some of the other players. He sort of touched on that a little bit, but I think that's what he's alluding to, is run fills, and specifically, I think a lot of it's tackling. And I think we talked about this after the Raiders game. I feel like we did with Asante. Asante had a great year by rookie standards, but I think it's asking a lot for someone of his size to be an outside corner that is responsible for run defense as well. And I think that showed up at times. And to me, that's kind of what he was alluding to. And I'm mashing a bunch of different questions together, and kind of what you brought up with that one question of what he said he's taken ownership, and he even used the word blame a little bit for what he thought was the pieces that he thought were there to play defense. And I guess if I were to assess it, that's probably, if I had to point to one spot, I think it's the interior of the line, specifically depth. I think Jerry Tillery was a bit of a liability against the run, and he pointed to so many things they like about Jerry Tillery, and so do I. Length, pass rush, ability to get after. He plays with a nice, nasty motor, but certainly he's got to sort out some run issues. And I think the secondary, specifically in that run defense, and their fills and their tackling ability was a bit of an issue.
And, in the same breath of talking about Tillery, he referenced Kaiser in year 4 and kind of the leap that he's taken. And by being so complimentary of Jerry, I think they still believe that Jerry has another level to get to, especially in this defense. And same with Michael Davis. I mean, he talked about how Milo and Gus really coached up Michael Davis as a developmental player in 2017. And then all of a sudden, Mike's got to learn a whole new system. So I think there's some growing pains with some of the existing pieces they have. And you mentioned Asante. I mean, like you're right. Like by rookie standards, he had a pretty good year. You're hoping in year 2, coupled with using that free agency as a tool and those 11 draft picks, is you can continue to bolster that secondary along with some other key pieces that may fit what Brandon Staley and company like to do best.
To me, that's going to be the interesting one. Because look, there's pretty much there's a few positions that rarely find their way to free agency if you've got really good players, and it's offensive tackles, defensive edge players and corners, and those, and obviously quarterbacks. But those positions, when you get them, you keep them. It's why, number ones are getting traded, or twos are getting, number twos are getting traded for Darius Slay. It's why 2-1s are going for Jalen Ramsey. It's why you see teams part with considerable draft capital to take on an elite player at that position, or spend an inordinate amount of money to load up at that position. And that's, I guess that's where the one issue is where do you find it? What's available? There aren't a lot of teams. Like, remember when somehow Fuller ends up going to the Broncos, and you're like, my God, of all the places, and they ended up needing it, because you got to have depth there, because guys go down. They're smaller guys. They're asked to tackle bigger guys typically. So, I think it's going to be interesting to see, because the way, if you look at now that some mock drafts are coming out, and, as I've been kind of getting ready to do my prep, I'm calling the NFLPA game. I'm going to the combine. So I've been digging into this for the last 5 weeks.
That's next week, right? NFLPA?
A week from Saturday. Yeah. January 29th, it'll be on NFL Network. So I'll be on the call out there at the Rose Bowl for that one. But as I'm digging in, look, there's some really good corners. It's going to be interesting to see at pick 17 what's there, because it's a deep offensive tackle class. I think it lines up where you have a couple of those big, meaty interior defensive linemen that should probably be there. You're probably going to have a couple athletic linebackers if you're starting to think about, how am I going to put this money puzzle together? And there's, the corners, I think there's premium in the corners. I mean, Stingley's going to go on the top 5, but I think once you get beyond that, I don't know how that's going to shake out, so it's going to be interesting to see how he attacks that position, because I don't think there's any question that they're going to have to add players, probably with high draft capital and free agency to that group.
Yeah, number 17 overall in the first, and then obviously you kind of see the depth of the class, and we'll learn more about it as the offseason goes on. It's funny with these press conferences, we don't really hear much about Justin Herbert or Rashawn Slater. I think Popper asked the first Justin Herbert question like an hour in, because you know what you have in Justin Herbert and Rashawn Slater, right? So it's like you're getting questions about Mike Williams and Derwin James and some of these free agents. Tom said he's going to kind of wait till it's time to make those decisions, but I think it's safe to say we know how he feels about Derwin James, and he referenced just the way Mike Williams played late in that Raiders game, and just the effort that he had in the fourth quarter and overtime. And, it would be nice to see Mike back in powder blue if they can make that work.
100%. I mean, Brandon Staley got emotional talking about it, the effort that Mike put out there. Problem there, of course, is it's a lot of money to tie up in that position. Keenan makes a lot of money. And I think that's where you're going to have to figure it out. I think if there is a player that's going to get the franchise tag, it's going to be Mike. I think that's the one. It's still a big number, but it's not a long-term deal you have to invest. You can go one more year. It's probably, I think, around $17 million. I think they just got an additional 9 carryover. So they're going to have close to $80 million in free agent dollars. So I think to me, that's the most realistic of it, of the options, letting him go, signing him to a long-term deal, or let's franchise him, and give it one more year and make sure this is what we need. This is what we want. You know what I mean? So I think, and look, let's not forget, Chargers wide receiver group had more drops than any wide receivers in the league. So I think by no means is that group beyond reproach. As good as they were, as ridiculous as the numbers were, and the fact that
thought too.
Yeah, I mean, they had more drops than any other group in the league. So I think you do have to do some self-scouting and make sure, hey, look, we love these guys. That's a bad stat. You do not want that stat on your resume. So that's going to be an interesting one. I'm with you though. I think it's clear that Herbert trusts Mike implicitly in those downfield throws. And that's when he takes the shots, that's where he wants to go. And that is such an important element of this offense. So but I think Mike's going to get offers. I believe that there's going to be some stuff out there, which is why I think the franchise is probably what makes sense there.
I think this season was so telling though for Mike because he really did become a more complete wide receiver under Joe Lombardi and Staley in this scheme, and that's something that Staley referenced back in his time in Denver, saying like, "Hey, when we scouted you, you were like a jump ball guy. You're a deep go guy," and now he's been able to do a variety of things, and you see the trust that Justin has in him. You almost put it on par with Keenan, and the way that Herbert trusted Keenan really from the beginning. You started to see that chemistry develop with Mike so much more in 2021. Yeah. So, and then you throw in the fact that Josh Palmer kind of came on towards the end of the year too. So, do you envision Palmer taking that next step?
Right. I think that's the big question, Chris. Yeah, because Josh, he's going to be good. Josh is going to be a really good player. So I think that's kind of what you got to figure out. Can we plug Josh into that role? Can we plug him into one of the outside spots and still feel like the drop off isn't significant enough that our offense takes a huge hit, and in the process we save $17 million to go spend on a right tackle, on a corner, on an outside corner, on a defensive tackle, what on a guard, whatever you may need. You know what I mean? So I think that's why I don't envy Ed and Tom and all these guys that got to figure this out. It's not just the player evaluation, but it's trying to get the financial pieces to fit. But so like, to me, so they've got $80 million. The reason why they have $80 million to spend, or whatever the number is, it's between 70 and 80, I think is what I saw on Sport Track, is because Justin Herbert's on his rookie deal.
Yeah.
So like, and I think that's part of it. It's like, man, this was year 2 and we only got 3 more of these, before that number's going to triple or whatever. Who knows what the number is going to be by then. But I think that's
whatever it is.
That's why, when that blank check shows up, you got to be able to fill in around him. That's kind of where I'm trying to figure out how Mike fits in. Like, okay, well, you can pay your wide receiver because your quarterback's at this number, so you can actually get away with it. You give him his 17.5 and keep Josh as an incredible 3. When you're giving those guys a breather, he immediately becomes a 1 or a 2 when either Keenan or Mike are off the field. So it's going to be a tricky one, no doubt.
Yeah, and I think you said this a few weeks ago too. Like, yes, the Chargers have the second most cap space in the league, but you got Derwin James. You got all these guys on defense that we talked about that I would envision you want to get at least a couple of them back that Staley is high on. Uchenna's another guy who played his best game against the Raiders in Week 18. And then you got to be selective in free agency, and then maybe add some dudes on special teams through the draft and just continue to develop what you have. Was there anything else that Tom said, Money, that you found interesting or worth mentioning?
Yeah, you know what? I'm looking at my notes here. I thought that it was interesting that he pointed out, it's in the off season, we got to focus on the entire team. It's not, a lot of people are thinking, they signed Corey Linsley last year. They signed Ibushi. They signed Matt Filer. That took care of the line, and they drafted Josh Palmer. They drafted Rashawn Slater. I think his point was, hey, that doesn't mean we're just going to spend all this money on the defense and we're going to draft all defense because of what we did last year. You kind of pointed out, the numbers are great, but the offense is still going to need attention. We're still going to have to do things on offense, and we're going to have to address offense. And I think that speaks to, what has historically been Tom's MO on the draft, and that's taken the best player available regardless of position. So I think, look, if it's an offensive tackle that's there at 17, it's number 1 on their board, and there's a pretty good sized gap between that tackle that's sitting there and the D tackle or the corner, I think they'll take the right tackle, especially after what they just saw in Week 18 and 11 pressures in the fourth quarter by Max Crosby. So, I think I thought that was interesting, because it almost felt like, in Brandon's presser, he pointed out, hey, look, we wanted to make sure Justin Herbert was right. That guy can't have a regression in this year. So, bring in Linsley, make sure Mike comes back, pick up that 5th-year option. Let's do everything we can to make sure his arrow is pointed up and he does not take a step back in year 2. Makes total sense. And then he talked about, now we got to focus on defense and we've got to find, and so I think it was almost no doubt we got to focus on defense, but let's not get complacent. A team could come out there and throw an incredible amount of money at Mike and we might have an issue, and you've got to retool and you've got to figure that all out.
And I think a great example of what you just said is the reason they drafted Brendan Hiatus, right? And guys like Trey McKitty. They didn't draft them for 2021. And those are two guys specifically that I think are going to have a bigger impact on the offense. Maybe Hiatus is a starter in 2022. I don't know. But maybe they like him enough at that point. But you're right. You're not drafting in 1 year for that specific year necessarily. Yeah. Sometimes you get that help, but you don't get all pro Rashawn Slater every year is what I'm saying.
Right. I think it is actually one of the, it is one of the things I would have liked to have seen this year, because it's as much as, and I'm not at practice, so I don't know what it looks like in practice, but what it probably tells you is it didn't look great. But look, when they had to plug in Storm for an entire game, he played fine. I'm sorry, when they had to plug in Trey for Storm, when Storm was out and they had to play Pipkins for an entire game, he played great.
Yeah, he did.
I would have liked to seen more just to take inventory. Like, hey, can Trey be the guy? I would have liked to have alternated those two maybe and at least rotate him just to see if Trey could be the guy. I would have liked to have seen Hiatus a little bit. Like, if you think his arms aren't long enough and he's gonna fit as a guard, I would have liked to have seen him a little bit out there, because I thought he looked really good in the preseason. I thought he looked better than Balog at right tackle in the preseason. So but it's the preseason. So I feel like because they were so competitive, and Tom said it repeatedly, because they were competing for the division, in mid-December, that prevented the idea of development. It's, hey, we got to put our best guys out there for every single snap. They're in all these one-score games. You can't afford to do that. And that's one of the, unfortunately, the missed opportunities from the season, because they were competitive until the final play of the final game in overtime with an extra 10 minutes. And that's, what you sort of miss out on when you have those situations.
So Tom's presser was over an hour. I suggest you guys listen to it. I mean, we're just kind of supplementing, giving our thoughts on what we heard, but it also kind of signals the end of the 2021 season and a little bit of a break here as we get ready for the draft. And Money, you mentioned the PA game that you're going to be calling. So we're going to take a little bit of a hiatus on Chargers Weekly this next month. Be back the week of the Combine. So I'm not sure if I'm going to be in Indy. I know you will. And we'll have reports from the Combine and pick this thing up. But a little bit of a break, Money, and we'll get back at it here in about a month or so.
No doubt. Looking forward to it, man. And who knows, maybe an emergency Chargers Weekly will show up if we really like what we see at those NFLPA, East-West Shrine, Senior Bowl games. We start to put our mock drafts together, try to guide Tom Telesco with all of our brilliant observations and suggestions. But I'm looking forward to it, Chris. I've really enjoyed it this year.
Yeah, absolutely, man. We'll have the emergency emoji alerts.
There you go. Exactly. The sirens.
Yeah. The sirens. So,
and for our old listeners, the emergency sound, since we're here in Southern California, I'll give that to you for the old folks.
That's one thing I need to do is we need like a soundboard. We need a soundboard for this.
There you go. Or, maybe we don't.
Maybe not. All right, guys. Always appreciate you listening. We'll see you in about a month. For Money, I'm Chris.